"Julian, what are you doing here?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly as I found him standing in my living room, his shirt clinging to his chest from the rain outside. He looked up, his eyes wide with surprise. "Ava, I didn't think you'd be home this early." I felt my heart race as I took in the sight of him, his dark hair damp and disheveled, his hands nervously fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. The air between us was thick with tension, a tension I had been trying to ignore for weeks. "I told your mom I'd be here to fix the leak in the bathroom," he added quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, trying to steady my breathing. Right, the leak. I forgot. The truth was, I hadn't forgotten. I had been avoiding being alone with him, afraid of what might happen if I let my guard down. But now, here he was, standing in my house, and there was no escaping the pull I felt towards him. The first time I met Julian, it had been a rainy afternoon much like this one. I had gone to check on his mother, one of my tenants, who had been struggling to make ends meet after her husband left. When I arrived, it was Julian who opened the door, his face a mixture of surprise and embarrassment. "Mom's at work," he had said, his voice soft but steady. "Can I help you with something?" I had introduced myself, and we had talked for a while. He was polite, respectful, and surprisingly mature for his age. As we spoke, I could see the weight of the world on his shoulders, and something inside me had stirred, a desire to help him, to ease that burden. Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn to their apartment more often than necessary. I would bring groceries, offer to help with repairs, and sometimes just sit and talk with Julian's mother. But it was Julian who always seemed to be there, quietly watching, listening, and occasionally offering a word or two. One day, his mother had come to me with tears in her eyes. "Ava, I don't know what to do. We're going to lose the apartment if I don't find a way to pay the rent." Without thinking, I had offered to let them stay with me until they got back on their feet. It was a decision I hadn't fully thought through, but something about Julian's quiet strength had made me want to protect him, to give him a chance. And so they had moved in. Julian and his mother took the guest room, and our lives became intertwined in ways I hadn't anticipated. We shared meals, talked late into the night, and slowly, the walls I had built around myself began to crumble. But it was the little moments that made me realize how deeply I was falling for him. The way he would smile when he thought no one was looking, the way he would offer to help with chores without being asked, the way his eyes would linger on mine when we were alone. I had tried to ignore it, to push those feelings aside. He was young, my tenant's son, and I was his landlord. It was wrong, wasn't it? But the more time we spent together, the harder it became to deny what I felt. And now, standing in the living room, the rain pouring down outside, I could feel the distance between us shrinking. Julian took a step towards me, his eyes searching mine for something, permission perhaps? "Ava," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. I didn't let him finish. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us and kissed him. It was a desperate, hungry kiss, full of all the pent-up emotions I had been holding back. And to my surprise, he kissed me back, his hands gripping my waist as if he was afraid I would disappear. When we finally pulled apart, I could see the same conflict in his eyes that I felt in my heart. "Julian," I breathed. "This is wrong," he finished for me, his voice heavy with emotion. "I know, but I can't help it. I've wanted this for so long." I felt a shiver run down my spine as he leaned in again, his lips brushing against mine in a gentle, tentative kiss. This time, it was slower, more deliberate, as if we were both savoring the moment. Our hands found each other, fingers interlocking as we pressed closer together. The rain outside seemed to echo the storm raging inside me, a storm of desire, guilt, and something I couldn't quite name. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting together as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. "Ava," Julian whispered, his voice trembling, "what do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I couldn't go back to pretending I didn't feel this way. But the reality of what we were doing, what we were risking, was terrifying. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely a whisper. "But I can't stop." He nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and longing. "Neither can I." We stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of our choices pressing down on us. And then, without another word, he kissed me again, and I knew there was no turning back. The rain continued to fall, the sound of it drowning out everything else as we gave in to the storm within us. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. The rain didn't stop. It hammered against the windows, a relentless rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. Julian's lips were still on mine, his breath warm and urgent, and I felt myself being pulled deeper into him, into this moment that shouldn't have happened, but felt so inevitable. His hands trembled as they rested on my waist, hesitant yet hungry, as if he was afraid I might disappear if he held on too tightly. I didn't. Instead, I leaned into him, my hands finding the damp fabric of his shirt, clutching at it like a lifeline. The scent of him, rain-soaked and slightly musky, filled my senses, and I felt dizzy with it. This is wrong. A voice in my head whispered, but it was drowned out by the sound of the rain, by the way Julian's fingers traced the curve of my spine, sending shivers through me. Ava, he murmured against my lips, his voice broken, pleading. I don't know what we're doing. I don't either, I wanted to say, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I kissed him again, my lips pressing harder, desperate to silence the doubt, to drown out the guilt that gnawed at the edges of my mind. His hand slid up my back, pulling me closer until there was no space left between us. I could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of my blouse, the way his heart raced against my chest. The kiss deepened, slow and searching, as if we were both trying to memorize the way it felt, the way we fit together. His tongue brushed against mine, and I gasped, my fingers tangling in his damp hair. He made a low sound, almost a groan, and I felt it vibrate through me, igniting something I hadn't let myself feel in years. Julian, I breathed when we finally pulled apart, both of us panting, our foreheads pressed together. His eyes were dark, pupils blown wide with want, and I could see the same conflict mirrored in them: guilt, desire, fear. He cupped my face in his hands, his thumbs brushing against my cheeks. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice shaky but firm. Tell me this is wrong, and I'll walk away. I'll pretend this never happened. I couldn't. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I reached up, covering his hands with mine, holding them in place. This is wrong, I thought again, but the way his touch made me feel alive, seen, wanted, was too much to deny. I can't, I whispered, my voice breaking. I can't tell you to stop. He exhaled sharply, his breath warm against my skin, and then his lips were on mine again, harder this time, more insistent. His hands dropped to my waist, lifting me effortlessly until I was sitting on the edge of the counter, the cold granite biting into my thighs. I wrapped my legs around him instinctively, pulling him closer, and he groaned, his hands sliding up my legs, sending a wave of heat through me. His lips moved from my mouth to my jaw, trailing kisses down my neck, each one sending sparks of electricity through my body. I tilted my head back, my hands clutching at his shoulders, my fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. Julian, I whispered, his name a plea, a prayer, a warning. He paused, his breath hot against my skin, and I could feel the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself back. Ava, he said, his voice rough, I need you to tell me this is okay. I need to know this is what you want. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze. His face was etched with desperation, with longing, and I knew he was waiting for me to give him permission, to absolve him of the guilt. Do it, I told myself. Tell him to stop, walk away. This can't happen. But when I opened my mouth, what came out was, I want this. I want you. His eyes darkened, and then his lips were on mine again, his hands moving lower, his touch setting me on fire. The rain outside seemed to grow louder, the storm raging in tandem with the one inside us. I was lost in it, in him, in the way his hands explored my body, the way his lips made me forget everything else. He pulled away suddenly, his breath ragged, and I felt a pang of fear that he'd changed his mind. But instead, he reached for the hem of my blouse, his fingers trembling as he peeled it away from my skin. The cool air hit me, and I shivered, but the warmth of his hands chased away the chill. You're beautiful, he murmured, his eyes roving over me, and I felt a flush of heat spread through me. His hands hovered over my skin, as if he was afraid to touch me, to mar the perfection he saw. But I wanted him to, needed him to. Julian, I said, my voice barely audible, please. That was all it took. His hands were on me again, his touch searing, and I felt myself unraveling under him. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered word sent me spiraling further into him, into this moment that felt both fleeting and eternal. Ava, he murmured, his lips against my skin, I've never felt like this before. I knew what he meant. There was something about him, about us that felt different, dangerous, forbidden, and yet I couldn't pull away.
I didn't want to.
The rain kept falling, the storm outside mirroring the one within us. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the age difference, not the guilt, not the consequences. There was only him, only us. Julian, I said, my voice trembling. But he cut me off with a kiss, his hands moving lower, and I forgot what I was going to say. Forgot everything except the way he made me feel, the way he was making me alive. The sound of the rain grew louder, drowning out everything but the sound of our breathing, the soft gasps and murmurs that escaped our lips. And then, as he leaned in closer, his hands exploring every inch of me, I heard him whisper, "I don't want to stop." "Then don't," I replied, my voice shaky but certain. And he didn't. The rain continued to pour outside, a steady rhythm against the windows that matched the pounding of my heart. Julian's hands were still on me, warm and insistent, and every touch sent shivers down my spine. His lips traced a path along my neck, and I gasped, my fingers tangling in his damp hair. I shouldn't be doing this. This is wrong. The thought flickered through my mind, but it was quickly overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of what I was feeling. Julian's presence was intoxicating, his closeness undeniable. His voice had been so soft, so vulnerable when he'd whispered those words, "I don't want to stop." And now, as his hands moved lower, exploring with a tenderness that belied his youth, I couldn't bring myself to pull away. "Ava," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. His voice was shaky, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Are you sure?" I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. He was young, barely more than a boy, and I was his mother's landlord. There were 100 reasons why this shouldn't be happening, why I should stop it before it went any further. But then I looked into his eyes, wide and expressive, and saw the longing there, a longing that mirrored my own. "Yes," I thought, the word echoing in my mind. "I'm sure." "Yes," I whispered back, my voice barely audible over the rain. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine, and then his lips were on mine again, soft and insistent. His hands fumbled with the buttons of my blouse, his fingers trembling slightly. I reached up to help him, my own hands shaking as we worked together to undo the fabric. The cool air hit my skin as the blouse fell away, leaving me exposed. Julian's breath caught, and he stared at me for a moment, his eyes dark with desire. "You're so beautiful," he said, his voice low and filled with awe. I felt a blush creep up my cheeks, but I didn't look away. There was something about the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, that made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of his body through the thin fabric of his shirt. "Julian," I breathed, my hands sliding under his shirt to feel the warmth of his skin. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed into my touch, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Ava," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't. I cut him off with a kiss, silencing his doubts. "It's okay," I wanted to say. "We'll figure out together." But words seemed unnecessary in that moment. Instead, I let my actions speak for me, my hands exploring the lean muscles of his chest, the curve of his back. Julian responded eagerly, his own hands roaming over my body with a mixture of curiosity and desire. We stumbled backward, our movements clumsy and uncoordinated, until I felt the edge of the couch against the back of my legs. I sank down onto the soft cushions, pulling Julian down with me. He followed willingly, his body pressing against mine as we kissed with a growing intensity. His hands were everywhere, touching, exploring, and I couldn't get enough. "Julian," I gasped, breaking the kiss to look up at him. His eyes were dark, filled with a desire that made my heart race. "Are you sure about this? Do you want to?" He didn't let me finish. Instead, he leaned down and kissed me again, his hands moving to the waistband of my skirt. "I want this," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor in his hands. "I want you." His words sent a thrill through me, and I nodded, my hands moving to help him undo the clasp of my skirt. It fell away, leaving me in nothing but my undergarments. Julian's breath hitched, and he stared at me for a moment, his eyes wide with wonder. "You're incredible," he murmured, his hands trembling as they reached out to touch me. I shivered at the contact, my body reacting to his touch in ways I hadn't anticipated. Julian seemed equally affected, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he explored my body with a mixture of curiosity and awe. "You're amazing," I whispered, my hands moving to his waist to undo the button of his jeans. He froze for a moment, then nodded, his breath hitching as I eased them down. We were both exposed now, our bodies pressed together in a way that felt both intimate and electrifying. Julian's hands moved to my hips, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat of him against me. My heart pounded in my chest, and I looked up at him, my eyes searching his for any sign of hesitation. "Julian," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Are you sure?" He nodded, his eyes dark with desire. "I'm sure," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I want this. I want you." His words sent a thrill through me, and I nodded, my hands moving to his shoulders as I pulled him closer. "Then don't stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. And he didn't. Julian's hands moved lower, his fingers teasing and exploring with a gentleness that made me gasp. His lips trailed down my neck, leaving a trail of fire in their wake, and I arched into him, my body responding to his touch in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every movement, every touch was electric, and I found myself lost in the sensation of him. "Ava," he murmured, his breath hot against my skin. "You feel amazing." I gasped, my hands tangling in his hair as he kissed me again, his tongue exploring mine with a growing intensity. The world outside seemed to fade away, the sound of the rain drowned out by the pounding of my heart and the soft gasps and murmurs that escaped our lips. Julian's hands moved lower, his fingers teasing and exploring, and I couldn't help but arch into him, my body responding to his touch in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every movement, every touch was electric, and I found myself lost in the sensation of him. "Julian," I gasped, my voice trembling. "I need." He didn't let me finish. Instead, he kissed me again, his lips soft and insistent, and I felt the tension building inside me, a coil that threatened to snap at any moment. "Ava," he whispered, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. But he didn't finish. Instead, he kissed me again, his hands moving lower, and I felt the tension building inside me, a coil that threatened to snap at any moment. "Julian," I gasped, my voice trembling. And then he was inside me, and the world seemed to explode in a burst of sensation. My fingers dug into his shoulders, and I clung to him as we moved together, our bodies fitting together in a way that felt almost perfect. "Ava," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. But he didn't finish. Instead, he kissed me again, and I felt myself spiraling out of control, the tension inside me reaching a breaking point. "Julian," I gasped, my voice trembling. And then the dam broke, and I felt myself shatter into a million pieces, my body convulsing as the pleasure washed over me. Julian's breath hitched, and he clung to me, his body trembling as he reached his own peak. For a moment, we were both lost in the sensation, our bodies trembling as we clung to each other. And then, slowly, the world came back into focus, the sound of the rain outside growing louder once again. Julian's breath was warm against my neck, and I could feel the rapid beating of his heart against my chest. "Ava," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. But he didn't finish. Instead, he kissed me again, his lips soft and insistent, and I felt the tension building inside me once again. "Julian," I gasped, my voice trembling. And then he was moving again, his body pressing against mine, and I felt the tension building inside me once again. "Ava," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. I could feel the weight of his body against mine as the world around us seemed to dissolve into nothingness. His lips were on mine again, gentle yet insistent, and I couldn't help but respond, my hands threading through his damp hair. It was as if time had stopped, and all that existed was this moment, this forbidden, electric connection that I had tried so hard to deny. "Julian," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper, trembling with something I couldn't quite name. "We shouldn't." He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, wide with a mix of longing and uncertainty. "I know," he said, his voice equally quiet but edged with a raw honesty that sent a shiver down my spine. "But I can't stop. Not now. Not with you." His words hung in the air between us, heavy and unspoken. My heart raced, and I felt a tug deep within me, a pull that I couldn't ignore. I wanted to protest, to remind him and myself of all the reasons this was wrong. But the way he looked at me, his gaze so full of unspoken need, made it impossible to think clearly. Instead, I found myself reaching for him, my fingers brushing against the curve of his jaw. His skin was warm, slightly damp from the exertion of our closeness, and I could feel the faint stubble under my touch. He leaned into my hand, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as if savoring the contact. "Ava," he murmured, his voice low and rough. "You have no idea what you do to me." I didn't have a chance to respond before his lips were on mine again, this time with more urgency. His hands roamed over my back, pulling me closer, and I could feel the heat radiating from him, a fire that threatened to consume us both. The kiss deepened, our breaths mingling as the tension between us reached a fever pitch. I wanted to stop. I knew I should, but every rational thought was drowned out by the overwhelming sensation of his touch. His hands slid lower, his fingers grazing the curve of my hip, and I gasped, my body arching unconsciously toward him. His name escaped my lips, a soft, desperate sound that only seemed to fuel his intensity. "Tell me to stop," he whispered against my lips, his voice strained. "If you want me to stop, say it." But I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. Instead, my hands clung to him, my fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt as if afraid he might pull away. His breathing was ragged, matching my own, and I could feel the rapid beat of his heart against my chest. "Julian," I managed, my voice barely audible. I don't want you to stop." It was as if a dam had broken. His hands moved with more purpose, his touch igniting a fire within me that I had long thought extinguished. His lips trailed down my neck, each kiss sending a jolt of electricity through me. I tilted my head back, giving him better access, and a soft moan escaped my lips. "You're so beautiful," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "So beautiful it hurts." His words sent a wave of warmth through me, and I felt a rush of something I hadn't felt in years. Desire, yes, but also something deeper. Something that terrified me. His hands moved to the buttons of my blouse, his fingers trembling slightly as he worked them open. I should have stopped him. I knew I should have, but instead, I watched, my breath coming in shallow gasps as he revealed more of me. His eyes darkened as he looked at me, and I could see the hunger in his gaze. He leaned down, his lips brushing against the exposed skin of my collarbone, and I shivered, my hands gripping his shoulders for support. "Ava," he whispered, his breath hot against my skin. "I've wanted this for so long." His words stunned me, a confession that left me breathless. How long had he felt this way? How long had he been holding it in? I didn't have time to process it before his lips were on mine again, his kiss more demanding, more insistent. His hands slipped under my blouse, his fingers tracing the curve of my waist, and I felt my body respond, a heat building low in my abdomen. I was losing myself in him, in the way he made me feel. Every touch, every kiss was a revelation, a reminder of what it felt like to be alive. I had spent so long burying these feelings, these desires, that I had almost forgotten what it was like to want, to be wanted. But with Julian, it was impossible to ignore. His hands moved higher, his fingers brushing against the edge of my bra, and I gasped, my body arching toward him. He pulled back slightly, his eyes searching mine, intensity burning in his gaze. "Is this okay?" he asked, his voice rough with need, but still so incredibly gentle. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. His eyes softened, and he leaned in, his lips brushing against mine in a soft, almost chaste kiss before he resumed where he had left off. His hands moved with more confidence now, his touch sending waves of pleasure through me. I felt myself unraveling, every nerve in my body alight with sensation. His name escaped my lips again, a desperate plea that only seemed to spur him on. His lips trailed down my neck, his hands moving higher until they found the clasp of my bra. With a deft motion, he released it, and I felt the fabric fall away. For a moment, he just looked at me, his eyes filled with a reverence that took my breath away. Then his lips were on me, his touch igniting a fire within me that I had long thought extinguished. My hands tangled in his hair, pulling him closer, and I felt myself losing control, my body responding to him in ways I hadn't thought possible. "Julian," I gasped, my voice trembling with need. But before I could finish, his lips were on mine again, his kiss swallowing my words. His hands continued to explore, his touch both gentle and insistent, and I felt myself being swept away, lost in the sheer intensity of the moment. "Ava," he whispered against my lips, his voice trembling with emotion.